Good morning. My name is Mariana Montoya, and I welcome you to this webinar on strategies to respond to the criminalization of environmental defenders in the context of the application of Article 9 of Escazú. The objective of today's event, as you know and as the title suggests, is to discuss the issue of criminalization as one of the most widespread forms of attack against defenders of the land, the environment, and territories in Latin America and the Caribbean. The purpose of today's event is to raise awareness about criminalization as it has become a threat to prevent defenders from exercising their rights to access to information, participation, and justice in environmental matters, and also to share best practices and strategies to address the situation in Latin America. As you know, the Escazú Convention seeks to ensure the full implementation of the rights to access to information, participation, and justice in environmental matters and environmental defenders in Latin America and the Caribbean. Environmental defenders are not only crucial for the correct implementation of the Escazú Accords. The Escazú Accords are also an indispensable tool for the protection of these defenders, who have been in the front line for many years and for a very long time to guarantee sustainable development, environmental democracy, and the right to a healthy environment for all people. The Escazú Accords are therefore a crucial tool for these people to guarantee their security. And today, after some initial presentations, we want to build a new tool to guarantee their security with all the people who are with us today. After some initial presentations, we will open the floor to questions from the audience, but also to their experiences, and we hope you will tell us firsthand what kind of recommendations you have and what kind of experiences you have had on the issue of criminalization. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first panelist today, Lady Zuluaga. Lady is a legal researcher and program coordinator at the Information Center for Business and Human Rights. Lady will give us a brief introduction to the issue of criminalization to put us in context. Lady, thank you very much. Good morning, and you have the floor. Good morning, Mariana, and good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today. And first of all, I will try to be brief to give space to my co-panelists and also to give space for questions and comments. As Mariana mentioned, I work for the Business and Human Rights Information Center, which is an international organization that, among other issues, has been monitoring the situation of human rights defenders since last year at a global level. In the framework of our work, as I mentioned, we have been compiling attacks on human rights defenders around the world for years. And basically, this data is based on public resources and on public sources of information found on the websites, in press releases and reports by civil society organizations or other agencies in the field of human rights. We have also included non-lethal attacks, such as criminalization, and it is precisely within this global mapping that we have carried out where we have identified Latin America as one of the regions that is most affected in terms of human rights defenders. This means that our data indicates that Latin America is one of the most dangerous regions for human rights defenders of the land, of territories, and of the environment. And this mapping has allowed us to identify that Brazil is one of the most dangerous countries, followed by Mexico, Honduras, Peru, and Colombia. This doesn't mean that other countries in our region aren't affected more and more. We find cases in Ecuador, for example, in Argentina, and also in countries like Venezuela or Costa Rica. So it's very important to take this point into account because, in terms of the data that we have, it indicates that criminalization in and of itself, or different forms of judicial or legal harassment, are the practices that are most recurrent. Let's say that we have seen, or there are many organizations that focus on information about lethal attacks such as assassinations. But from the center, we have gone a little further and we have been able to see how judicial harassment and criminalization are being used more and more by different actors. And all of this data that I have mentioned shows that about 51% of our cases have to do with judicial harassment, which is very characteristic of Latin America. Let's say that within this concept of judicial harassment, we can include situations related to unjust or arbitrary detentions, with the use of laws that criminalize freedom of expression, the right to protest, and the right to the freedom of association, but also with the use of, for example, judicial actions by different actors. And this is a very important point in our region because we see these actors increasingly using criminal tools such as defamation, incitement to commit a crime, damage to property, or illegal association to intimidate and silence human rights defenders in Latin America, which is what this is what we're seeing. And this has very serious implications for our region, not only in terms of the defense of human rights, but also in terms of how these attacks seek to silence, intimidate, and threaten human rights defenders and create a high level of pressure on these people, which in some contexts leads to the protection of land, territory, and the environment being taken out of the equation. So I think that in Latin America, as I have been mentioning, the role of the state is important. It is one of the actors, but companies and different sectors of the economy also have an important role to play. On the one hand, everything that has to do with legislative reform in some contexts is important, but also everything that has to do with how judicial systems and how our judges, magistrates, and people who work in public prosecutors' offices, for example, are prepared to really take on cases from a human rights perspective. I will leave my presentation at that, Mariana, to give some space to my colleagues. Thank you. Thank you very much. Um, Thank you, ladies, so much. I will leave comments, including my own and questions, for the end. And at this point, I will give the floor to Ale Leiva. Ale is a lawyer and human rights consultant in Mexico. Ale is going to share with us the national perspective in her experience, how she and the defenders that she works with have worked on the issue of criminalization in Mexico. And she will also share with us strategies from the point of view of civil society to address the situation. Ale, you have the floor, and thank you very much. Hello, and thank you so much for this invitation and for participating in this parallel event in the framework of the Escazú Accords. As my colleague Lady already mentioned, on this vision in the regional aspect of criminalization, I'm going to focus on criminalization and the patterns of criminalization and in the context of this type of violence against people and communities defending the environment, land, and territory in Mexico. If you will help me to introduce the current context of sociopolitical violence. It is also violence that fights against a certain vision of development and the defense of territory and the environment in Mexico. In this sense, it's important to highlight, for example, the existence of national development policies and plans that do not respect the collective rights of indigenous peoples. And we have identified that one of the causes of the generation of social environmental conflicts are these development plans that each administration and each presidency brings with it. This is where the main investment development projects of the 6 year term are going to be defined. And these are precisely the areas that are going to generate conflict or areas that have already generated conflict, where they reach certain points of violence in which they have recently continued. Just yesterday, Senda presented its report in which it registered aggressions, and where, in this universe of aggressions, criminalization occupied the sixth place in terms of aggressions committed in Mexico during the year. In previous years, has been ranked as one of the main threats. And although it is now ranked sixth in this report, this does not mean that it has been eliminated or that we are in a situation where it is less of a threat. In fact, Mexico is currently considered the country with the highest number of murders of environmental defenders, with Global Witness registering 54 murders. Another issue that needs to be highlighted in the current context in Mexico is the situation of enforced disappearances and the lack of searches for living persons, which has also affected this sector of the defense of human rights, such as the environment. Currently, one of the cases that has attracted attention is the disappearance of Ricardo Lagunas Vázquez and Antonio Díaz Valencia, who have been forcibly disappeared for 3 months, and there has been no progress in the investigation or in the search for them. In order to present the scenario of criminalization in relation to other types of aggression to which people and communities are constantly subjected, but also from civil society and from the people and communities that we have accompanied and worked with on this issue, we have recognized that there is a certain profile that is the victim of this type of criminalization. We have seen that this type of violence and criminalization is concentrated on this type of profile. And in general, we have identified some of the strategies that a variety of actors, both civil society organizations and networks such as collectives, have tried to use to deal with cases of criminalization. On the one hand, making visible the historical violence against indigenous peoples in many countries in the region, but even in Mexico, it has been a major issue since criminalization is not an aggression or a current issue, but rather criminalization directed at this type of leadership or women and men from indigenous people is also part of a historical pattern of violence in their territories and the lack of recognition of their collective rights. There are also other types of actions that have been dedicated to counteracting the discourses that systematize the defense of the environment and attack community legitimacy. In this sense, Mexico's various authorities have also replicated a discourse that points the finger at defenders and communities as enemies of development, which generates or questions the legitimacy of the defense of these of the environment of territories, which leads to a very vulnerable context. Another crucial strategy has been the accompaniment in criminal or judicial processes in cases of criminalization, but from a human rights perspective, where the activity of environmental defense is one of the main lines of research by and investigation by the prosecutors, and also to create networks, monitoring observation missions, and the documentation of cases has been an important action which has been carried out by civil society to make these cases visible and to be able to generate an impact both at the national and international level. The following media campaigns of visibility, visibility of creating visibility and recognition of environmental defense has undoubtedly been one of the strategies that in cases of criminalization has worked to generate pressure and to generate recognition in public opinion, especially in the absence of action by the authorities, mainly local authorities and local prosecutors. And also, another important action has been the accompaniment for the analysis and implementation of requests for protection measures, both national and international. Mexico has federal and local laws for the protection of human rights defenders and also journalists, and several states have their own local mechanisms that are equivalent to the federal mechanism. But they have not been able to counteract or articulate measures at the local level to combat cases of criminalization. And above all, an important point is also the documentation of the impact generated by this criminalization on the social movement, but also on the person, on their family, and in a social aspect. And the demand for integral reparation of the damage after this criminalization is also an important issue that Mexican civil society has promoted, above all in the application of the general law on victims in the country, especially in the application of this general law of victims. There has been a lot of work. So, what are some of the challenges that have been identified against criminalization in Mexico? Mexico is undoubtedly in a context of impunity and corruption that has favored this type of violence, which has been identified as structural and constant violence. And one of the issues is also of great that is also of great concern in Mexico is the presence of organized crime, which has expanded and diversified and is now present in different territories. In these cases of criminalization in Mexico, the relationship with other types of aggression that create a context in which criminalization is actually conductive to the execution of arbitrary detentions in the context of demonstrations and social protests. The use of criminal offenses, such as the crime of obstruction, the execution of, a job, is one of the most recurrent crimes for which both state and private companies have filed complaints in cases of criminalization in Mexico. The use of criminal offenses um, such as these are used often in cases of criminalization in Mexico. In this sense, the investigations and the judicial processes have violated due process and the presumption of innocence. There's a lack of analysis of the context, and uh, there there is no right to the defense of human rights, as there's no protection of the right to defense of human rights as part of the investigations of the public prosecutor's office. At the moment, there is another situation that is also very worrying, and that is the unofficial pre-trial detention, which is part of the Mexican legal system, but which has already been shown to be unconstitutional. And even recently, the Inter American Court for Human Rights told the Mexican state to modify and eliminate this pretrial detention because it violates several human rights. And even environmental defenders have spent around 12, 13 years in unofficial pretrial detention alone. These are some of the patterns that civil society has identified in cases of criminalization. And the Escazú Accords are undoubtedly an opportunity to promote public policies in the region and in countries like Mexico that are in a critical situation of violence that is truly comprehensive and that focus not only on prevention but also on attention to urgent cases and on the investigation and punishment of aggressions, and above all, public policies in which a variety of institutions are responsible for generating a budget for the prevention and punishment of aggressions. The protection mechanisms that exist at the federal and state levels can be strengthened in order to comply with Article 9 of the Escazú Accords, without forgetting that many of the cases and root causes of this violence have to do with development policies, with the management of social environmental conflicts, and also with cases of criminalization and responsibility on the part of the state, but also on the part of companies and vis-a-vis the state, but also on the part of these companies, it's very important to realize their role and to make visible other types of actors that are also present. Thank you very much, Ale, for that very deep presentation on the situation of criminalization in Mexico and for sharing with us the specifics of the context in the case of your country, which I believe are also shared in the context of many, many other countries in Latin America in terms of organized crime and the collusion of companies and states in cases of criminalization. I'm going to now give the floor to Melanie Vasquez. Melanie is the coordinator for the environmental education area of the Observatory for Marine and Coastal Governance. Melanie, thank you very much. Um, Good morning. You have the floor. So, very good morning to all of you as well. I'm going to share my screen, as you can see. But first, I need you to give me permission to share my screen. Okay, so let me introduce myself. My name is Melanie Velasquez Lozano. I am the coordinator of the education area of the Observatory for Coastal and Marine Governance. And today I'm going to present a course that we did at the end of last year called Strengthening the Technical Legal Defense of Environmental Defenders in Colombia. And you will see the presentation in parallel in English for all of our participants below. So the aim of this course was to contribute to strengthening the technical legal defense of environmental defenders with emphasis on the local level through the training of defense lawyers. Our main objective was to cover four thematic blocks. The first one was the conceptual aspects. The second one was international legal defense. The third one was experiences in other countries, comparative law, and the fourth one was national legal defense. Here they saw the human right to defense of the environment, risks the execution of this right, defenders, and what criminalization is. Next, in the second block, we have what was the legal defense at the international level. Here in international law, what we wanted was for our participants that had all of these to have all of these mechanisms and these international instruments that serve for the legal defense of the environment at the international level. Here we have the topics of international mechanisms for the protection of persons and communities defending the environment, land, and territory. The Escazú Agreement or Accords is a fundamental tool towards environmental democracy. And this we did at the same time next to the Escazú Agreement to recognize and protect those who defend the environment, land, and territory. Um, and we could do this a, in an asynchronous way, and we uploaded it and recorded it on the platform we chose for the course. And the last experience of elitism at the international level for the protection of the rights of environmental defenders. In the third block, we have what is the experience in other countries, so comparative law. Here we had the opportunity to have two experiences. It was the experience of Mexico on the protection of people and communities defending the environment, land, and territory, and access to international environmental justice experiences. And in Argentina, what I could tell you is that what is really important is that from block 1 to 3, all of these concepts can be applied at the Latin American level. But the next block, or the fourth block, is focused on the national level, which is called national defense, where we could see all of the topics such as criminalizations, strategies used against environmental defenders in Colombia, mechanisms of national defense for environmental defenders, environmental crimes and criminal law, and investigative techniques, which were divided into sessions, for the robustness of all of the concepts that uh, so that all of these concepts could be covered in a very integral way. And I would like to share with you some of the results of this next course. So, who participated in the course? We had the participation of people nominated by social organizations, NGOs, trade unions, or universities. And the purpose of the course was not that it be massive or that there would be a huge number of participants, but to make a close call through nomination to strengthen organizations and also to generate a safe and very trusting environment for all of the participants who carry out litigation and for our teachers as well. And the purpose of the course um, was really to strengthen these organizations that were participating. So, in case you would like to make the presentation of a case in which we're working next to the live session of the agreement. So in this live session, we allowed the participation of organizations that are allies of the observatory, and that meant that we had leaders from Buenaventura, which is part of the Colombian Pacific region, and 14 leaders from Santiago de Tolu, which is part of the Colombian Caribbean region. And something important that we wanted to highlight from the course is that the majority of the participants were women. 58.8% were women. In terms of the age distribution, we had a very good distribution. As you can see in the graph, we had a distribution from 18 to 70 years old. And because it was a course for male and female lawyers, but as you can see, we had nominations from or people participating um, from universities. So we also had the participation of law students. So that meant that we had an age range between 20 and 20, uh, above 20 years old, but most of the participants were around between 21 and 40 years old. In terms of the origin of the participants, you can see on the map that most of them are from Colombia and from different areas of Colombia. But we also had the participation of two people, one from Murcia in Spain and another from Maldonado in Uruguay. And well, thank you very much for listening to me. That's what I wanted to present about the course. And any questions or concerns you have, you can leave them in the Q&A box or in the chat. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much, Melanie. This initiative is very important to strengthen the capacities of the defenders to be able to face the risks and threats that they face. And I would like to highlight the importance of linking those who are studying law and who are the future lawyers to train them to start working on issues related to the defense of the environment and to the defense of those that defend the environment. Um, for each and every one of us. I'm going to now give the floor once again to Lady Zuluaga from the Information Center for Business and Human Rights, who's going to continue to share with us the tools that exist to be able to confront the criminalization of human rights defenders. So thank you very much once again, and you have the floor. Thank you, Mariana, and thank you very much, Alejandra and Melanie, for sharing the work that you have been doing. It's undoubtedly very important for the issue of criminalization and for the region in general. I think that in order to close, I would like to highlight the work that many organizations in Latin America have been doing on the entire issue, not only of criminalization, but specifically on what has to do with the documentation of criminalization, which is a little bit what I mentioned in the first part about the work that we have been doing from the Information Center. But now I would like to focus on the work being done by other organizations in Latin America and also on the work being done by Alite, the Alite coalition that I mentioned earlier from the coalition that Mariana mentioned at the beginning, which in English is Alliance for Indigenous Life. So, in this sense, I think it's very important to emphasize that in the framework of the Escazú Accords, one of the discussions has to do precisely with the issue of the elaboration of reports or the documentation, registration, and creation of data that allows us to really know what the situation of human rights defenders in the regions is. And I think that this is where it is important to highlight the work that many organizations in Latin America have been doing on this issue, even though it's not an obligation that the states would have to document and to be clear about um, what is the data on this issue. It's important to highlight the work being done by many organizations on this. Um, and to be clear about what the data is and what the situation is and how that that gap left by the states on what that information is being filled by civil society organizations. And I think it's important to highlight, for example, the work of women defenders with the database on attacks against women who are doing different work, including different types of work on this, including on land, territory, and the environment in Latin America, as well as the work of local organizations such as UDF or CINEP in Guatemala and in Colombia, and Somos Defensores, which is also in Colombia, Senda, Senda, as Alejandra mentioned yesterday, has published its report on last year's data. But also, other organizations at the global level are also highlighting the situation in Latin America, such as Global Witness or Frontline Defenders. And I think that beyond these local strategies, I would like to draw attention here to what is being done precisely by frontline defenders. I think that beyond, yes, we have to think about a global alliance where different organizations from around the world, from the Pacific to Latin America, have come together to look at and evaluate how to protect human rights defenders. In terms of land, territory, and environment, indigenous peoples, and other issues, and within the framework of this alliance, a specific group has been formed to deal with the issue of documenting attacks on human rights defenders. Where, as I mentioned in the first part of the presentation, there has been a focus on lethal attacks, but given the issue of criminalization and other types of attacks, these organizations have also taken on the banner or the goal of revealing more about the personal situation of human rights defenders. From this perspective of non lethal attacks, some reports have been published, and I can give you one of these links where it has been pointed out that what we know from civil society and where the strategies have been initiated by civil societies to expose this situation are really just the tip of the criminalization problem um, in Latin America. And Alejandra told us a little bit about her experience, and I have also told you about what we have done from the Information Center. It is only a small sample of what is happening, and we know that the problem is much bigger, and that is where the state should be documenting and collecting more information. precisely in the framework of the sustainable development goals, where there is a specific indicator related to human rights defenders, and where, let's say, in another report published by Live Quantification Alliance, which is called Critical Gap, they found that only a few countries, a very small percentage of countries, document or present information on the situation of human rights defenders, which means that there's a very large gap in the data in Latin America. And that's why many organizations have tried to fill that gap and collect this data. But it's not the role of civil society organizations. And that is where it is important that the Escazú Accords and their implementation are precisely an impulse or a motivation so that the states in our region can increasingly reveal what is happening, document what is happening. Obviously, taking into account the work that the organizations that I have already mentioned are already doing. So it's very important that in the framework of one of the strategies to address criminalization is to really know where criminalization is going. And I think in this small space, we can talk about um, what is necessary to know not only the actors that are involved in criminalization, because what we have said is that the state is one of those actors, but there are also other actors like companies or economic sectors, and in also in other spaces, there are other actors, including illegal miners. But also, Alejandra mentioned the whole issue of drug trafficking or organized crime in general. So there's a lot to understand in terms of criminalization. But also in other spaces, um, there are a whole variety of actors involved. And there's a lot to understand in terms of in this region in terms of which are those actors and what are the real impacts that this has on Latin America, and what are the different legal arguments and what are the reforms that we need at the legal level, but also public policies and others that allow us to ensure that there is prevention of criminalization, but not only prevention, also once the defenders are already criminalized. So, how can we stop this criminalization as such? In many spaces, there is a discussion about how to guarantee the legal protection of defenders, how to guarantee that there's no pro bono support, or, for example, through different law firms in our region, to guarantee psychological support for the defenders. Because when we talk about criminalization, we're actually talking about the fact that there's an emotional, psychological deterioration due to the stigma represented by the fact of facing a criminal trial or a civil trial, as I mentioned earlier. So some strategies are already underway, but there are other strategies that need to be thought about in terms of how to address all of the harm and all of the impact that's directly related to these types of criminalization. And finally, a last strategy or space that I wanted to refer to today is something that we have also been doing from the Information Center in Latin America with the Latin American Network on Strategic Litigation on Business and Human Rights. This is a network that was set up about a year and a half ago, where the Information Center has brought together different environmental activist organizations and human rights academics to discuss the issue of strategic litigation on business and human rights. So I think there are some strategies that, as I said, are being developed by different organizations at the international, regional, and local level. But it is important to address in a more holistic way all the impacts that are caused by human rights violations. Um, so, how do we address for in a more holistic way all the impacts that, for example, criminalization has, and to make a call precisely in the framework of the implementation of the Escazú Accords to ensure that all of these strategies that address this harm are more integral and holistic, and above all, from the role that the states have in terms of documenting and effectively protecting the rights of people defending our territory, our land, and the environment. Thank you very much, lady, for that presentation and for reminding us of the importance of addressing all the risks that environmental defenders face in a holistic way. I'm now going to open the floor to the participants, but before we do that, we can open uh, this question and answer session. We're going to suspend the YouTube broadcast to make this a more private session, and we invite those who joined this webinar via YouTube to register and now join via Zoom if possible. For security reasons, we prefer to make this a more private session. Um, so, as you can see, the YouTube has session has been suspended. Um, so now I would like to invite those who are joining us to raise their hand or write the questions for our panelists in the chat. And while people raise their hands, I have a question for the panelists from the perspective of international civil society. As Lady mentioned, that is the Alliance for the Defenders of Indigenous Land and Environmental Rights is a coalition, an alliance of several organizations. And most of our members are international organizations or at the global level, as well as several of the people who are with us today. So, my question is, what can civil society organizations do to support? We have seen, for example, some tools and strategies that the panelists have shared with us today, but what are some concrete actions